This is not a how-to video. It is an advice video. There's a difference there. And that's important because I'm going to be talking about a difference that I think a lot of people overlook. Today I want to talk about, in part, what I've been reading recently. Because this is actually my second book on Vlad Dracula. Partly because I'm curious about the Balkans, circa the Crusades and all that. But mostly because in a year or two I'm planning to write my own vampire story, some fantasy stuff, and I've got a lot of plans, and you should definitely stay tuned. The basic pitch of the idea that I'm looking into is, what if Dracula was Cortez, and he's the one that encountered the Aztecs, and all hell breaks loose? Vampires, conquistadors, and Age of Sail, and pirates, and magic, and ancient gods, and just throw in a bunch of fun stuff. Which means that there's a lot of things worth researching for that, instead of just like, I don't know, taking tropey ideas from movies I've seen and smashing them together and just making a bad imitation of Pirates of the Caribbean. That doesn't mean that I'm going to go write a novel's worth of content about every little nuance of this fantasy world I'm going to be exploring. Because that would be what I call world building, whereas this is research. And a lot of big name authors are going to will give you this advice politely. If you've watched my videos, I'm not a very polite guy. Research, good. World building, terrible. Don't world build. Like, it's really a giant waste of your time, 9 times out of 10. I cannot tell you the amount of people that I have seen just get sucked into the nuances of their world building. That does not create a product that sells. People care about stories, they care about characters, they care about the final product, and world building is like this informational layer beneath the product they care about, which maybe you, the author, really need to have your head wrapped around in order to build it correctly, but it's not the product. Don't be like so many Dungeons & Dragons dungeon masters that just end up making these like 100-page world documents that nobody wants to read. Pro tip, your players will not read your setting document. You can pay them and they will not read it. It's not going to happen. You need to give them like a paragraph that you can verbally remind them of, because they don't care. D&D players show up for the D&D game. That's why everyone still plays frickin' Forgotten Realms, even though it's a completely insane and somehow also boring setting. It's because people don't want to relearn anything. They want generic, they want familiar, they want to just use something they're already doing because they are there for the game, they are there for the story, they are there for the dungeon, and it's really typically just the dungeon master getting off on how awesome his reasons for the dungeon are. Just don't world build. However, if you don't have a world, you'll end up making a very shallow story. This is where Brandon Sanderson's advice on, I think he just calls it the iceberg method of world building, where as you build the story, you're going to notice things that you need to have answers for. And that's actually a very small amount of what a real world constitutes. That's why he calls it the iceberg. He says the reader sees this little tiny amount, and they're going to actually imagine everything under the surface, which you don't actually show them ever. Can't see the bottom of the iceberg. They're going to assume, if you wrote a good story, that you built all these things right, and they're going to imagine it, and that gives you the freedom in other books in that setting to go and expand it. But all these big professional authors that will say, like Stephen King, will tell you that world building isn't building a story. Just don't do it. It's a complete waste. Will also tell you that the best thing to help with your writing is research. Research. Know what you are talking about front and back. And the distinction I'm trying to advise here is that when you research, 1,000 different things about medieval Europe, and you can talk about everything from Napoleon to Caesar to Charlemagne to Vlad Dracula to Charles the Hammer to how the Ottomans structured their government and all that. If you know how these things actually worked and you have some understanding of why they worked that way and the consequences they had, you can fill in the gaps in your story very easily. For example, because I do need to market my brand new shiny book coming out on the 14th of August, which you can pre-order this or buy it if you're watching this video late. Link will be in the description. This takes place in a megacity. And researching for this was largely just like interesting subjects I've looked into over the last 20 years of my life. Because if you have 1 billion people in a city, I need to know things like how much space does that actually take? How much food does it take to feed 1 billion people? What are wastewater treatment facilities like? How large of a military does 1 billion people support? And I can just go on and on and on and on. And for a lot of those questions, because I have a reasonably good understanding of what today's technology is for things like, what does it take to provide electricity, air conditioning, security? How do you line up 1 billion people with jobs, even theoretically? How are people going to transport through a city with that many people? Is it private transportation, public transportation, on foot, through bridges, walkways, elevators, staircases? Because I know these things going into it, of how these things actually work, and I have a decent understanding of like actual city planning, when the plot calls for things such as I need a really grimy place that pays people poorly or something, I can fill in the gaps because I already understand how these things work, and I can give answers that will always mesh with themselves. Which is why in the first book in the series, I needed a place that normal people wouldn't go into, and like sketchy, slightly illegal operations can go into. And I wanted to explore some of the ways of how the city works, because it is kind of a weird idea. How do 1 billion people live in a walled city? So what I explored was the idea of internal plantations, because people have looked into this for actual cities, so these giant metropolises aren't just completely reliant on trucks bringing food in and in and in and in, feed these populations of millions of people. Like they have designs that have flaws. And you can kind of explore that and what that might look like in the future. But because I've done all that research, when the story demands I answer it, I can actually fill it out. Relatively satisfying, I think. When I get questions of like, well, what do people drink in a bar? I can go, well, based on what I've established about the autonomous farming systems, like there probably is going to be grain, because you simply need farmland to feed that many people. You can't do it all through wastewater reclamation or something, sewage treatment. You can't do it all like that. So they're going to set up systems for grain. Are they going to set up systems for hops and barley? I mean, they could, but is it more interesting to say that they don't do hops? So what they call beer is really just slightly beer-flavored seltzers? Does that make for a more interesting setting? Slightly more dystopic? Does it give that feel of tech-noir? I think it does. That's why beer isn't really beer in my setting. That's why most meat is lab-grown, unless you're very rich and you can import it from the colonies. And people start getting testy about, hey, that tobacco, is that real tobacco you got there, or is that just some moss with nicotine that burns off? Because people will pay for real tobacco because it's a status thing. Cancer is going to be solved in 100 years. Those are the advantages of research, because you can just answer them. And when you come in for the next book and you say, all right, well, here is a restaurant that's seafood based, and they're actually like the walls are made out of these giant floor to ceiling aquariums where you can actually see the mutant lobsters that they're going to be cooking for you, because they've all been GMO juiced up to be super extra meaty, while feeding off of food waste. I can do that in the next book, even though I had no idea that was a thing in the first book, because I generally understand how these things work and I can blend them together, and it feels like in the first book, I knew that existed, even though I made it up in the second book. Whereas if I had written a giant Bible of all things world building, or worse, put it out in public, all these rules of the setting, that would be like handcuffing myself. I highly advise against it. Now, in this specific instance, I'm actually struggling. If you know anything about the wars in the Balkans, oh my god, there is so much mismanagement and betrayal and little fiefdoms and princedoms and the incursions and crusades from the Hungarians, from the Turks, from the Ottomans, from the Serbs, from the Poles. Oh my god, do I understand how this kicked off World War I now. You could spend a 4-year college degree trying to understand the politics in the Balkans. And I'm getting some good ideas. But I need to do a lot more research before I do Dracula Fights the Aztec. But that's my advice to writers thinking about getting into this or just examining it, or maybe they've tricked themselves into thinking that a bunch of world building needs to be done, because I do want to acknowledge it's really satisfying to world build. I just genuinely advise against doing anything that you don't have to do. Figure out the systems, the tones, the themes, the source inspiration, and go from there. Don't tie yourself down, because you'll probably come up with better ideas later, and you want that freedom to adjust. And when you're giving yourself that freedom, what you're also doing is focusing on the characters, because in a lot of ways the characters don't really matter to the world in a lot of ways. Like, most human interactions can happen in space and fantasy, in a cave, you name it. And it should still come across as like basic human interactions. The drives, the motives, the betrayal, the love, the passion, you name it. A lot of it can be achieved without world. So your job as a writer trying to make a good product is to just fill in the gaps in a way that leaves the reader imagining more than what you've actually tied yourself down to. So that's my semantic argument about the difference between research and world building. Yeah, drop a like, drop a comment below about if you actually read the Silmarillion, because I guarantee you, everyone who has this fixation with world building does so because of the success of the Silmarillion, which I don't think anyone is ever going to replicate. Or I could be wrong. Maybe there is a book that's literally just world building like the Silmarillion is, and it's actually successful, but I've never heard of it. Till then, please like, subscribe, tell your friends, buy my book. Cheers.